I remember the first time I saw the cabin after my ex-husband's death. It was early November, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and doesn't let go, even when you're wearing every layer you own. I was 34 then, a few months past our divorce and still not fully used to being alone after years of shared routines and tiny arguments that seemed so trivial in hindsight. His name was Robert, and the cabin sat deep in the Cascade Mountains, the kind of remote wilderness that feels like the world stops existing outside of the trees. After he died unexpectedly in a car accident on a rainy night in October, I had received a letter from the lawyer handling his estate. The cabin was mine now. No heirs, no will complications. Just a small wooden structure on the edge of a dense forest, a place I hadn't set foot in for over a decade. I drove there in my old Subaru, the tires crunching over fallen leaves and patches of early frost. The road narrowed as I went further into the mountains, twisting and bending until it was barely wide enough for my car. The sky was heavy with gray clouds, the kind that promised snow or rain, or both. By the time I reached the clearing where the cabin stood, the sun was low, casting long shadows between the skeletal trunks of pine and fir. The cabin looked smaller than I remembered, almost fragile in the midst of the towering trees, its wooden siding gray and worn, the roof sagging slightly in the middle. It had been years since Robert had kept up with it. The windows were dusty, and I could see the faint outline of leaves piled against the corners of the walls. I parked near the front, my breath visible in the cold air, and took a long look at the place. For a moment, I felt a strange mix of grief and relief. Robert had been difficult, charming and cruel in equal measure, but he had loved the wilderness. Maybe that's why he had spent so much time here. He had told me once, years ago, that the cabin was his sanctuary, a place where he could escape the noise of the world. I wondered what he would have thought about me now, walking back into this space alone. The door was stiff, and I had to shove it hard to get it open. Inside, the air was heavy with dust and the smell of old wood, damp and musty. Sunlight filtered through the grimy windows in thin, golden streaks, illuminating floating motes of dust like tiny sparks. The cabin was sparse, one main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area with a broken stove, and a narrow stairway leading to a loft bedroom. The furniture was still there. A threadbare sofa, a wooden table scratched and scarred, a couple of chairs that wobbled if you leaned on them too hard. I set down my bag and walked slowly through the space, touching surfaces gently as if the wood itself might remember Robert and whisper his presence back to me. As I moved through the cabin, I realized how quiet it was. Too quiet. No birds, no wind, just the faint creak of the wooden floorboards under my feet. It was the kind of silence that made your own breathing loud, the kind that made small, normal noises, like a twig snapping outside, sound like someone was coming for you. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on me. I went to the kitchen to inspect the stove, thinking maybe I could make coffee, but the gas valve was rusted shut. I made a mental note to fix it tomorrow. For now, I settled into the sofa and pulled out my coat, trying to get warm, though the cold had already settled into my bones. Hours passed as I explored the cabin and its small surroundings. I found an old shed behind the main structure, filled with stacked firewood, an old wheelbarrow, and tools coated in a thin layer of rust. Beyond the shed, the forest thickened quickly. I could see deer tracks in the frost and the occasional squirrel scampering across the forest floor. The mountains were quiet, almost unnaturally so, and I felt a creeping sense of unease. Not fear exactly, but that primal awareness that comes when you're alone in the wilderness. Night came fast. The forest became a wall of blackness, and I lit the cabin's old kerosene lamp, its light flickering and casting long, trembling shadows against the walls. I was alone, entirely alone, except for the sounds outside. The crunch of small animals, the distant howl of a coyote, the wind brushing through the trees. I made a small fire in the fireplace, the wood crackling and popping. The warmth was comforting, but the isolation pressed in on me, the way it does when there's no one around for miles. That's when I heard it. A soft sound at first, almost like the shuffle of boots through leaves. I froze, straining to hear. Came again, slower this time, deliberate. Outside, my heart started to hammer. I reminded myself that I was in a remote area where hikers sometimes wandered or hunters came, but something about the rhythm of the steps felt off. I didn't hear a voice, didn't see a shape, just the crunch of leaves and the faint scrape of something moving against the ground. I grabbed a flashlight and crept to the window, pressing my face to the glass. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the edge of the clearing. There was nothing at first, just shadows. But then, I caught a glimpse of movement. Something crouched low, moving slowly between the trees. My stomach tightened. Whoever or whatever it was didn't seem like a normal hiker. They were careful, deliberate, almost stalking the cabin. My mind raced. I thought about the neighbors, but there were none for miles. My phone had no signal. I went back to the fire, trying to calm myself. Maybe I had imagined it. The isolation could make your mind play tricks. But then I heard the sound again, closer this time, and I realized it wasn't imagination. Someone, or something, was circling the cabin. My pulse quickened. I remembered the shotgun Robert had kept under the bed. I hadn't even thought to bring it, and it seemed miles away upstairs. Panic and cold fear mingled. I didn't know if it was a person or an animal. My gut screamed that leaving the cabin meant death, or worse, being trapped outside in the dark. Hours passed like that, each sound outside setting my nerves on edge. I stayed near the fire, my hands wrapped around a mug of cold coffee, my eyes darting to every shadow. Finally, near 3 a.m., the sound stopped. The stillness was heavier than the movement had been, a thick silence that made the cabin feel smaller, suffocating. I stayed awake until dawn, listening, trembling, too afraid to close my eyes. When the first light of morning filtered through the trees, I gathered my courage and stepped outside. The ground was disturbed, footprints, unmistakably human, leading around the cabin in circles. Whoever had been there had left no other trace. No clue about identity or intent, just a presence, a reminder that I was not as alone as I thought. I checked the perimeter, saw nothing in the dense forest beyond. My relief was fragile but real. The fear lingered, but the daylight gave me perspective. I spent the next few days fortifying the cabin as best as I could. I reinforced the door, blocked the windows with furniture, and made sure the firewood and supplies were in easy reach. I stayed vigilant, listening to every sound, marking the perimeter. Eventually, I started to feel the weight of solitude lift. The presence that had haunted the night seemed to recede with the sun, leaving only the forest and its natural noises. I knew I would never forget that night, and I knew I would never leave the cabin unprepared again. By the end of the week, I accepted that the cabin and the memory of my ex-husband would always carry a shadow. But I also realized something important. Fear is real, but survival is stronger. I had faced the unknown alone and lived. That clarity, strange as it was, gave me a sense of control I hadn't felt in years. I didn't need ghosts or fairy tales to haunt me. The world itself, wild and indifferent, was terrifying enough. And yet, I had endured, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could endure anything. The cabin was mine now, truly mine, and I was determined to claim it. Not as Robert's retreat, not as a place of memory, but as a place where I could be entirely alone and entirely strong. Every creak in the floor, every shadow in the corner, every whisper of the wind through the trees reminded me of the night I had survived. And every day, as the sun rose over the mountains, I told myself that no darkness, no fear, No footsteps in the night could take that from me. I was 32 years old that September night in 1998, driving alone through northern Arkansas after spending the day hiking through some trails I found on an old map. The Weather Service called it a light storm earlier in the afternoon, but it turned into a heavy cold rain as sunset got near. The sky looked darker than normal for that hour, and the clouds hung low over the hills like heavy blankets. My clothes were still damp from sweat and rain, and all I wanted was a dry roof and a little heat. I didn't plan to spend the night anywhere near this stretch of woods. My plan was to camp farther south the next morning, but when I saw that old handmade sign nailed to a crooked tree that said, "Cabin rental ahead 2 miles," I thought maybe I could get lucky. My windshield wipers were working hard, pushing sheets of water away every few seconds, and I could barely see the narrow road ahead. My headlights hit puddles that looked like tiny lakes. I kept thinking the road might flood, and I didn't want to risk sleeping in the car. The cabin came into view after a tight bend that felt like it appeared out of nowhere. It sat a little back from the road, on a patch of gravel and mud. It was small and dark brown with a tall metal roof that made loud rattling sounds every time the rain hit it. There was one single window facing the road, and weak yellow light leaked out from inside. A plastic chair sat on the porch, and an old red gas container leaned against the wall next to a rusted metal water bucket. I didn't see anyone around, but there was a note taped to the door saying payment could be left inside a wooden box, and a key was hanging from a nail under the porch roof. I stepped out of my truck and felt the cold rain hit the back of my neck instantly, running down inside my shirt. The ground felt slippery and soft, and I almost fell once when my boots slid on the wet gravel. I grabbed the key, unlocked the door, and went inside. The air in the cabin felt damp and heavy, like nobody had opened the windows for months, but there was an electric heater glowing orange near the far wall. I closed the door and listened for a moment. All I could hear was rain pounding the roof and distant thunder rolling through the hills. The cabin had one small table, a chair, an old sink, and a full bed with a faded quilt. The wood floor creaked with every step, and the smell reminded me of old barns my father used to take me to when I was a kid. There were no pictures on the walls, and nothing personal left behind. I placed my backpack on the chair, took off my wet jacket, and laid it near the heater to dry. My shirt clung to my skin, and I could feel cold sweat along my shoulders. I noticed something strange right away, though. The floor near the front door had a long, dark stain shaped like a dragged line, running across the wood toward the back corner. It looked like mud at first, but the color was darker and more uneven. It almost looked like something heavy had been pushed across the floor many times. I tried not to think too much about it, telling myself it was probably nothing more than old water damage. After a while, the heater warmed the room enough that I could feel my fingers again. I sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the rain. The storm was picking up, hitting the windows hard enough that I expected them to crack. I thought about turning on the small radio sitting on the table, but I liked the quiet, or at least I thought I did. The strange thing about being alone in a small place during a storm is how every tiny sound feels louder and more personal. I swear I could feel vibration under the floorboards every few minutes, like something was shifting in the dirt under the cabin. I tried to ignore it. I tried to focus on the steady breathing of the heater and the sound of wind scraping against the roof. I lay on the bed, staring up at the ceiling beams, following the pattern of dark wood as if reading sentences. It must have been close to midnight when I heard the first sound that was clearly not part of the storm. Came from behind the cabin, outside, near the back wall. It sounded like something heavy stepping in wet soil. A slow, dragging step, then another. I held my breath without meaning to. My mind tried to make excuses immediately. Maybe a deer, maybe a large branch falling, maybe just my imagination after a long, tiring day. But the footsteps continued, slow and irregular, and they sounded too close to be an animal afraid of humans. I felt the hair on my arms stand up. I stayed completely still, listening to each step. The steps moved around the side of the cabin, toward the small window across from the bed. The room felt smaller by the second, like the walls were folding inward. Something brushed against the outside wall, and the wood made a dull thudding sound. For a moment, nothing else happened. I lay there staring at the window, barely able to see anything beyond the rain hitting the glass. I forced myself to breathe slowly. My heart was beating so hard I could feel the pulse in my neck. The rain masked most sounds now, and I almost convinced myself whoever or whatever it was had moved on. But then something scraped lightly against the window glass. Not a knock, not a branch, something slow, controlled, almost like someone dragging a finger, testing the strength of the window. I felt a chill run through my chest even though the heater was still glowing behind me. My mind raced through every possible explanation. None of them made sense. I sat up quietly and reached for my backpack, pulling out the small flashlight I used earlier on the trail. I clicked it on, pointed it at the window, and saw nothing but rainwater. But the noise stopped the moment the light hit the glass. I kept the beam steady for a long time, waiting, listening. The storm outside was louder than ever, wind howling like a warning I didn't want to understand. After a while, I turned the flashlight off and set it near the bed. I decided sleep wasn't happening, so I sat upright, watching the window, barely blinking. Every few minutes, I thought I heard something outside, but it was impossible to tell if it was real or my brain inventing noise from the storm. The hours dragged slowly. My legs felt stiff and my eyes burned, but I couldn't bring myself to relax. Sometime early in the morning, maybe a few hours before sunrise, I heard another sound inside the cabin this time. A light creak near the back corner, right where that long dark stain ended. I turned my flashlight toward the spot, and my stomach knotted instantly. The wooden floor there was slightly raised, like a loose panel. I hadn't noticed that before. The panel looked wide enough for someone to fit through. I stared at it for a long time, flashlight fixed on the wooden edge. I couldn't hear movement after that, but knowing that floorboard wasn't sitting flat the whole time made my skin crawl. My mind kept replaying those dragging footsteps outside, matching them with that dragging-looking stain on the floor. When the first week daylight finally pushed through the clouds, I packed my things fast. I didn't bother folding anything. I shut off the heater, opened the door, and stepped out into wet morning air. The rain had slowed, but everything outside was soaked and muddy. As I walked back to my truck, I looked around the ground near the back of the cabin. The mud was full of deep prints, not animal prints. Human prints. Bare feet. They weren't old either. The edges were still smooth and soft, not washed away by the rain. They led from behind the cabin toward the tree line. Some were deep enough to show the heel and toes clearly, pressed hard into the mud like the person was carrying heavy weight or dragging something behind them. I didn't want to think about what might have been under that loose floor panel or what might have been watching me through the window that night. I didn't care about getting my payment money back from the box inside the cabin either. I just got in my truck, started the engine, and drove without looking back. I didn't tell anyone about it, partly because it sounded ridiculous, and partly because nothing actually happened to me physically. But every time I think of that night, I can still hear that slow, careful step in the wet soil, and I still see those deep, bare footprints behind the cabin. I know someone was out there. I know someone was close. And I know I left right on time before I ended up stuck under that loose board or dragged through the woods in the dark. I never drove that road again. I never rented a cabin again. And I never trusted an empty place with a key hanging outside after that rainy night. I remember the summer of 1998 like it was yesterday. I was 24, restless, and itching to get away from the city for a while. I had inherited a small piece of land from my uncle up in the northern forests of Maine, somewhere near Baxter State Park. The property had an old, abandoned cabin on it, barely standing, hidden among dense pines and thick undergrowth. I had never met the man who left it to me, but I'd seen the deed and the faded pictures he had sent. The cabin was nothing fancy, just a squat, wooden shack with a tin roof, but it seemed like the perfect escape from my crowded apartment in Portland. When I first arrived, the air hit me like a punch. It was thick with the smell of wet earth, moss, and the faint tang of old decay. The gravel road leading to the property ended abruptly, and I had to push my car through overgrown tracks barely wide enough for tires. The forest pressed in around me, and the silence was so heavy I could almost feel it in my chest. The cabin itself looked worse than I had imagined. The wood was gray and splintered, parts of the roof sagging under years of neglect. The door hung crooked on rusted hinges, and some of the windows were broken, letting in wind and rain. Inside, dust coated everything. Cobwebs stretched across the corners like netting. I could see the outlines of furniture long rotted away. Maybe a table, a chair, some shelves, but it was mostly just bare floorboards and the ghosts of shapes that had once existed. There was a faint, sour smell, like mold mixed with something I couldn't identify. I spent the first night in a restless haze. I had a small tent in the back of my car, but I wanted to see the cabin before sleeping outside. I lit a kerosene lamp I had brought, and the flickering light made the walls seem alive, shifting and breathing. Every little sound startled me. The creak of a floorboard, the tap of water dripping through the roof, the whisper of wind through the broken windows. I didn't sleep well. The next day, I decided to explore the surrounding forest. It was thick and tangled, with fallen logs and low-hanging branches that made moving quietly impossible. I noticed signs of wildlife, tracks of deer and raccoons, a few bird nests, but also something else. Old footprints, too large for deer, pressed into the soft earth. They weren't fresh, but they were clear enough to make me uneasy. The tracks led deeper into the woods, toward a small clearing that I hadn't noticed from the road. Curiosity gnawed at me, but I tried to push it down. The forest was dense, and I knew it could be easy to get lost. By evening, I returned to the cabin, feeling a thin layer of anxiety settle over me. I tried to distract myself by clearing out a small section of the floor and placing a blanket down. The lamp flickered again, and I realized I hadn't checked the roof. Outside, the sky darkened, clouds thick with rain. A storm was coming. The wind picked up that night, rattling the cabin and making the broken windows shiver. I could hear the rain hammering the tin roof, punctuated by the occasional crack of a distant branch falling. Sleep didn't come easily, and every shadow seemed to move with a life of its own. I kept thinking I heard footsteps outside, crunching over gravel or twigs, but every time I leaned over to look, there was nothing. Just the rain, the trees, and the distant howl of a coyote. By the third day, I had begun to notice things that didn't make sense. Small items I thought I had left in one place were shifted. My backpack, the matches, the small box of food. I would leave them on the table, and when I returned, they would be in a slightly different spot. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, that I was tired and stressed. But the feeling of being watched never left me. I started barricading the cabin in small ways, closing the windows with boards I found in a collapsed section of the roof, nailing loose planks back in place. I even dragged a few rocks from outside to place near the entrance. I was careful not to make noise, but every time the wind howled, I jumped, certain someone or something was moving outside. It was on the fourth night that the fear became real. I woke to a noise like scraping on the wooden walls, slow, deliberate, and persistent. My heart raced. I sat up, straining to hear. It was coming from the side of the cabin, near the broken window I hadn't yet repaired. The sound stopped as abruptly as it started. I lay back down, convincing myself it was an animal. Maybe a raccoon, a fox, or a deer rubbing against the wood. But the more I thought about it, the less it seemed plausible. Morning brought a weak light through the broken windows, and I forced myself to leave the cabin to inspect the outside. That's when I saw the footprints. Human footprints, large and uneven, circling the cabin several times. They were fresh. I followed them into the woods, keeping a distance, and noticed they led toward the clearing I had seen earlier. My stomach turned. Whoever or whatever had been here had been watching me. Panic set in, but I didn't want to run blindly. I spent the next few hours preparing. I gathered what I could carry, including water, food, and my backpack. I didn't want to leave the cabin completely. There was too much history here, but I knew I couldn't stay unprepared if someone came back. The next night was the worst. The wind had died, but the silence was suffocating. Around midnight, I heard the sound again. Slow, deliberate footsteps on the roof. My heart froze. The roof was old, but not thin. I could feel each step shake the entire structure. I grabbed a heavy branch from the corner of the cabin, my hands trembling, and waited. The footsteps moved to the far side, then stopped. There was a pause, then the sound of scraping along the wall, low and deliberate, like someone testing the wood for weak spots. I knew I couldn't stay inside. I slipped out through the back, careful not to make noise. Rain had returned, soft at first, washing over the dirt and mixing with the earthy smell of pine. I ran toward my car, adrenaline giving me speed I didn't know I had. Behind me, I could hear the scrape of wood against wood, but no one chased me. I didn't stop until I was safely inside the car, locking the doors and starting the engine. I drove through the forest without looking back, the cabin disappearing behind the trees. The unease lingered for days afterward. I couldn't explain what had happened, whether it was someone using the abandoned cabin as a hideout, a drifter, or just local kids playing dangerous games. But I knew I had been in real danger. A few weeks later, I returned with the local sheriff. We found signs of habitation. A small fire pit near the clearing, scattered cans, and a crude bedding area under a fallen tree. There was no one there now. The sheriff told me people sometimes used abandoned cabins to stay off the grid for a while. Some were harmless, others less so. That was enough for me. I had no desire to find out which type had been watching me. I sold the property a few months later at a loss and never went back. But I can still remember the sound of those footsteps, the scraping against the walls, and the suffocating silence that followed. That cabin, hidden deep in the Maine woods, was a reminder of how thin the line between isolation and danger can be, and how quickly a place that seems empty can become the most terrifying spot in the world. I had been driving for hours along the backroads of northern Vermont in the summer of 2017. I was 25, recently out of college, and desperate for a break from the endless routine of city life and freelance work. I had rented a small, isolated cabin through a friend of a friend, somewhere near a tiny town called Eden Mills. It wasn't on any of the main maps, and the GPS seemed to give up the closer I got. The idea of spending a week in complete isolation had sounded peaceful when I booked it, but now, as the sun began to sink behind dense pine forests, a creeping unease was settling in. The cabin was tucked into a clearing about a half-mile off the main dirt road. The path leading to it was overgrown, the tires of my old Subaru crunching over broken branches and loose rocks. When I first saw the cabin, it looked even smaller than the photos. Weathered gray wood, a sagging porch, and a single window facing the road. No electricity poles, no signs of neighbors, just thick forest stretching in every direction. I unloaded my backpack, my hands trembling slightly, partly from the long drive and partly from the strange feeling of being completely alone in such a vast, quiet place. I stepped inside and flicked on the battery-powered lantern I'd brought. The air smelled of damp wood and something faintly metallic. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and I could hear the faint rustling of leaves outside. The interior was minimal. A small kitchen corner with a rusty stove, a table with a few chipped chairs, and a tiny bedroom with a thin mattress on the floor. A bucket in the corner served as a toilet. It wasn't luxurious, but it was mine for the week. The first evening passed uneventfully. I unpacked my supplies, cooked some pasta over the stove, and sat staring out the window at the forest. The sky darkened quickly, and soon it was a thick, inky black. I turned on a small solar-powered lantern and tried to read, but the silence of the forest pressed in around me, almost physically. Somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped, and my heart jumped. I told myself it was just a deer, maybe a fox, and tried to focus on my book. The next day, I decided to explore the surrounding area. There was a faint trail leading deeper into the woods, and I hiked for a couple of miles, taking note of the landmarks so I could find my way back. The forest was dense, the trees tall and close together. I saw a few birds, a squirrel darting up a trunk, but nothing else. As evening approached, I returned to the cabin and locked the door. Something about being alone in the forest at night was starting to get under my skin. That night, I woke around 2 a.m. to a sound outside. At first, it was faint, almost imperceptible over the wind rustling through the trees. Then I heard it again, a slow, deliberate crunch of boots on dry leaves. I froze, listening. The sound moved closer, stopping somewhere near the edge of the clearing. My first thought was that someone had wandered off the road, maybe a hiker or a hunter. My heart was racing. I tried to tell myself it was an animal, but the rhythm of the steps was too steady, too human. I reached for the small hunting knife I kept in my bag and crept to the window. Through the weak moonlight, I could make out a figure, tall, hunched, moving slowly. Whoever it was seemed to be scanning the area, stepping carefully. My stomach dropped. I had no cell service, and even if I did, calling for help here would take hours. The person, or whatever it was, didn't seem to notice the cabin. I decided to stay put, hoping they would move on. Hours passed. Every so often, I would hear the crunch of leaves again, always moving along the edge of the clearing. Dawn finally came, and with it, a thin layer of fog that clung to the forest floor. I dared to look outside. No one was there, but the ground near the tree line was disturbed. Footprints. They were big, heavy boots, leading off into the woods, away from the cabin. I felt a mix of relief and dread. Someone had been here, just a few feet from me, and I hadn't seen them until it was too late. I spent the day barricading the cabin as best as I could. I piled heavy furniture in front of the door, moved a chair under the doorknob, and pushed the mattress against the window. I had a small camping stove and a little food, but the thought of staying another night with someone potentially outside made me sick. That evening, I kept a low profile, moving only when necessary, and sitting with my back to the wall. I didn't sleep, too terrified that I'd hear those steps again. The third day, I decided I couldn't wait for them to leave. I had to make it back to civilization. I packed my backpack, keeping the knife close, and stepped cautiously onto the trail. The forest seemed thicker now, the path narrower and more overgrown. I moved slowly, listening for any sounds. At one point, I thought I heard a branch snap behind me. I froze. Nothing. I forced myself to keep walking. Hours later, I stumbled onto a gravel road. Relief washed over me. A small convenience store was just up the road, and as I walked toward it, I saw a man in a dark jacket leaning against his truck, smoking a cigarette. His eyes widened when he saw me, dirty, exhausted, wide-eyed, and he asked if I was okay. I nodded shakily and explained, in short, that I had been staying in a remote cabin and got a little worried. He didn't ask questions, just nodded and offered me a ride to the nearest town. Back in town, I stayed at a motel for the night. I couldn't stop thinking about the cabin, about the figure in the woods. Who had they been? Why had they been there, so close to me yet never approached? The mystery gnawed at me, but I knew one thing: I wouldn't go back. That cabin, that forest, was not safe for someone alone. Years later, I still remember every detail. The smell of damp wood, the creak of the floorboards, the sound of boots on leaves outside my window. It wasn't supernatural. There were no ghosts. It was real, terrifying, and entirely human. And that realization, knowing someone could be just a few feet away and you would never see them until it was almost too late, was far worse than any story about spirits. After that trip, I made a rule. I only stay in cabins that have neighbors nearby, even if I'm desperate for solitude. The memory of those footsteps, echoing in the foggy night, has never left me. I learned that sometimes the scariest things are the ones you can't explain, the ones that are entirely real and entirely dangerous. And that's a lesson I carry with me every time I drive into the woods, wondering if I'll be alone, or if someone else is already watching. I first saw the cabin on the map when I was scrolling through a travel blog late one night in 2013. It was in a remote part of Northumberland, England, perched on the edge of a forested hillside with views stretching toward the coast. The photos were almost too perfect. A small stone cabin with smoke curling lazily from a chimney, moss on the roof, and the trees hugging it from behind. I was 27 at the time, tired of city life in Newcastle and craving some solitude, so I booked a week there without thinking twice. The drive itself was long and quiet. As I left the main road and wound down narrow lanes bordered by stone walls and hedgerows, the air changed. It became cooler and heavier, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. By the time I reached the last turn before the cabin, the sun was dipping behind thick clouds, leaving the hills in a dark, bluish shadow. I parked near the cabin and stepped out, taking in the smell of wet wood and cold air. There was a feeling of isolation that made my stomach tighten, but I chalked it up to excitement and the novelty of being somewhere so secluded. The cabin was small, built entirely of weathered stone with heavy wooden beams supporting the roof. There was a single door, which creaked loudly when I pushed it open, and two small windows with thin, dusty curtains. Inside, the air smelled faintly of mildew, mixed with the lingering aroma of old firewood. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and in the corner, there was a small kitchen area with a rusted kettle and some old utensils. I dropped my bag and started exploring, running my fingers along the rough wooden furniture and examining the walls for any traces of previous occupants. Everything seemed normal, if a little neglected. By evening, I had built a fire in the hearth and was unpacking when I noticed movement outside one of the windows. At first, I thought it was a deer or a stray fox, but then I saw her, a woman standing among the trees at the edge of the clearing, watching the cabin. She wasn't moving much, just standing there, her posture rigid. Her hair was long, tangled, and dark, and her clothing looked like it hadn't been washed in months. Her eyes seemed to catch the firelight for a second before she disappeared behind the trees. I froze, unsure whether to be frightened or curious. The rational part of me told myself it must be someone from a nearby village, or perhaps a hiker who had wandered off the trail. I didn't feel comfortable, though, so I closed the curtains and tried to focus on the fire, telling myself it was probably nothing. Night fell quickly. The wind had picked up, whistling around the cabin and rattling the windows. The fire crackled, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should. I tried to read, but I kept glancing at the curtains, imagining her face pressed against the glass, watching me. It was a ridiculous thought, and I told myself so, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. Eventually, I drifted off to sleep, the fire dying down to embers. The next morning, I found footprints in the damp earth outside the cabin. They weren't animal prints, they were too narrow, too human. They led from the tree line toward the cabin, then stopped abruptly at the edge of the clearing. My stomach turned. Whoever had been there hadn't approached the door, hadn't left a note, hadn't even tried to make contact, but they had been close enough to see me inside. I spent the day hiking along the trails, trying to distract myself. The forest was dense, with twisted roots and damp moss covering the ground. The wind was constant, carrying distant, unplaceable sounds. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, the occasional bird call. I told myself again it was nothing, just the forest playing tricks on my mind. When I returned to the cabin at dusk, the feeling of being watched returned tenfold. I opened the door and stepped inside, and there she was. Not at the window this time, but in the corner of the clearing outside, just beyond the reach of the firelight. She was closer than yesterday, standing perfectly still. The air felt heavier, and my heart raced as I fumbled to close the curtains. But she didn't move away. Over the next 2 days, the sightings became more frequent. I began noticing signs that someone had been closer to the cabin than I was comfortable admitting. Footprints around the back door, branches bent as if someone had crouched behind them. One evening, I found a scrap of cloth, dark and worn, snagged on a bush near the cabin's path. Every time I looked outside, she was there, just standing, staring, her expression unreadable. I didn't dare stay inside at night anymore. I started sitting by the fireplace with the door locked, firewood close at hand, listening to the wind and the sounds outside. The tension became unbearable, but leaving wasn't an option. I was too far from any road, and the sky was overcast, making navigation dangerous without proper landmarks. On the 4th day, the situation escalated. I had gone to fetch water from the stream about 100 meters away when I felt the hair on my neck stand on end. Something wasn't right. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no wind, nothing but the distant, gurgling water. I froze and looked around, and then I saw her, emerging slowly from the trees, moving with a quiet, deliberate purpose. She didn't run or walk quickly. It was a slow, creeping movement. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I knew I wouldn't make it back to the cabin in time. I crouched behind a rock, heart hammering, trying to stay calm. She stopped, tilting her head as if she could hear me breathing. And then she vanished into the shadows again. My body shook uncontrollably, and I realized that whatever this was, she had been living in those woods long before I arrived. She knew the terrain, and she could appear and disappear at will. By the 5th day, I had decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed everything, leaving the fire to die down and the cabin as untouched as possible. But as I approached my car, parked on the narrow dirt track, I saw her again, standing at the edge of the trees watching. I froze, my hands gripping the steering wheel, unsure if I should confront her or just drive off. She didn't move, just stared. And then, slowly, she turned and walked into the forest, disappearing among the trees. I didn't look back as I drove down the narrow road. The cabin slowly disappeared behind me, swallowed by the hills and trees. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, a small village with cobbled streets and a pub with warm lights spilling onto the road. There, I finally allowed myself to breathe again, but the memory of her eyes stayed with me. The emptiness, the stillness, the absolute certainty that she had been watching me the whole time. Years later, I told this story to friends, and some laughed it off, calling it paranoia. But I know what I saw. She wasn't a ghost. She wasn't a legend. She was just real. A person who had chosen to live on the edge of the world, unseen by anyone but me. And I think about her often, imagining her moving silently among the trees, a shadow in the woods, always watching, always alone. That trip taught me a lesson I carry to this day. Some places are too quiet for comfort, and some people exist in the world without explanation, moving like whispers between the trees, closer than you think. I was 24 when I decided to take the job at that old farm cabin in northern Minnesota. The summer of 2003 had been unusually hot, but up in the forests near Lake Mille Lacs, it was cooler, the air heavy with the smell of pine and wet earth. The owner, a man in his 60s named Harold Jensen, had hired me to watch over the property while he went to visit his sister in Duluth. I didn't know much about him beyond what he'd written in his letter. He had a small, rundown cabin, some fields, a barn, and a few cows. Payment was generous, and I liked the idea of isolation for a few weeks. The drive up was long and lonely. Gravel roads twisted through dense pine forests, broken only by the occasional red barn or farmhouse. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, the sun was dipping behind the trees, casting long shadows over the uneven yard. The cabin was small, made of weathered gray wood with a tin roof that glinted dull orange in the evening light. Windows were dirty, streaked with grime from years of wind and rain. A small porch sagged under the weight of its own age, and the front door hung slightly off its hinges. I didn't feel fear yet, only a creeping awareness that I was utterly alone. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood, dust, and something faintly sour, like old milk. Cobwebs clung to corners, and I could hear the soft scuttling of mice behind the walls. The furniture was sparse. A wooden table, 2 chairs, a small couch, and a narrow bed. The stove looked ancient, but functional, and there was a bucket of water near the sink. I unpacked my bag, lit a lamp, and made myself a simple dinner of canned beans and bread. Outside, crickets chirped, and the wind whispered through the pine needles. The first night was quiet, almost too quiet. I fell asleep to the occasional snap of a branch hitting the cabin roof. Around 3 in the morning, I woke to a faint scratching sound, like fingernails on wood. My dog, a black Labrador mix named Rust, had curled up at my feet, ears pricked. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or a squirrel, but the sound persisted. Rust growled low, and I realized it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the floor beneath my bed. I grabbed a flashlight and carefully moved toward the sound. The floorboards were old and warped, but I saw nothing. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening. Over the next few days, strange things started happening. Rust refused to go near the barn, whining and growling at something I couldn't see. I'd wake up to find the back door, which I'd locked, slightly ajar. Tools in the shed were moved, sometimes just a few inches, but enough to unsettle me. Once, I found hoof prints in the muddy field that didn't belong to any of the farm animals. They were human-sized but shaped oddly, like fingers pressed into soft earth. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe Harold had some neighbors or workers checking in while I slept. Maybe I was just on edge. But one night, everything came together. It was raining hard. I was lying in bed, listening to the storm, when Rust suddenly jumped up, ears flat, hackles raised. I heard it before I saw it. A slow, deliberate footstep on the porch outside. Someone or something was standing there. I grabbed the old rifle Harold had left in the corner. My hands shook as I approached the window. Lightning flashed, illuminating the figure just outside. It wasn't a man exactly, or not fully. Its face was covered in dirt and mud, features twisted as if it had been carved wrong. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like it was imitating a human but didn't quite know how. It stared at the window for a long, cold moment. Rust barked violently, and the figure tilted its head, mimicking Rust's posture for a brief, terrifying second. Then it disappeared into the storm. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I kept the windows locked and barricaded the doors with furniture. In the morning, the porch was littered with deep, claw-like scratches, and the muddy prints led straight from the woods to the cabin. The air smelled of damp earth and decay. Over the next week, I barely left the cabin. Rust refused to go outside, and I didn't argue. I fortified the barn and fields as best I could. Each night, the scratching, the footsteps, the faint dragging sounds grew bolder. Whatever it was learning the layout of the property, learning me. I found hair stuck in the wooden fence, coarse and dark, like it had been rubbed there intentionally. I started keeping a journal. I noted the times I heard noises, the patterns of the prints, and even small details like the way the figure's shadow stretched differently than a normal human's. I realized it was intelligent, not random, not an animal. It watched, waited, and learned. Then one night it broke in. Rust and I were sleeping when I heard the door splinter. I grabbed the rifle and shone my flashlight. It was standing in the doorway, taller than a man, limbs too long, skin patchy and dark with mud. It tilted its head in that same unnatural way, almost curious. Rust lunged, teeth bared, and the thing backed away slowly. I fired into the ceiling to scare it, and it vanished into the woods. The next day, I packed my things. I knew I couldn't stay. I didn't care about the money or the job. I left the cabin as it was, locking the doors behind me, Rust at my side, heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. I drove through the gravel roads, never looking back. A week later, Harold called. He said he'd returned to the cabin and found the barn door ripped off its hinges, fences smashed, and his cows scattered into the woods. No prints, no tracks beyond the immediate destruction, just the evidence of something impossibly strong and precise. He didn't ask questions. He just said he'd sell the property and thanked me for staying. I never went back. Rust never stopped flinching at shadows in the woods. I tried to forget, but every time I see mud tracks or a broken fence, my chest tightens, and I can hear that same slow, deliberate footstep in my memory. Years later, I read a small article in a local paper about a series of livestock disappearances in northern Minnesota. Witnesses described seeing strange, humanoid figures, tall, covered in mud, moving unnaturally fast. No one caught them, and the cases went cold. I knew exactly what they were talking about. I had stared into the eyes of that thing, and it had stared back, learning me. The cabin is probably still there, standing crooked in the forest, waiting for the next person naive enough to take the job. The barn, I imagine, is even worse now, and sometimes, when the wind is right, I swear I can hear the faint sound of claws scraping wood, just beyond the tree line, as if it remembers me too. I don't talk about it much. People would think I was insane, but Rust remembers, and when I hear him growl at shadows in the corner of the yard, I know that some things, some creatures, exist outside explanation, outside fear, and you are never truly safe when they are nearby. It was the spring of 2008, and I had finally managed to take a week off work. I was 29 and burned out from city life in Denver. My friend Jacob had told me about an old cabin he rented up near the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in southern Colorado. He said it was isolated, perfect for clearing your head, and that I could bring my dog, Sam. Sam was a 3-year-old border collie mix, smart, alert, and loyal, but I knew he could be nervous around strange sounds in the wilderness. I left Denver early in the morning, my old Subaru packed with supplies. A cooler of food, a small camping stove, some bottled water, and a few cans of dog food. The drive itself was scenic, the snow-capped peaks in the distance, the smell of pine and fresh earth filling the car whenever I cracked a window. By mid-afternoon, I turned onto a dirt road that was barely wide enough for my car, let alone two vehicles passing each other. The trees grew denser the further I drove, and the road was littered with potholes and small rocks that rattled the suspension of the car. When I finally reached the cabin, I had to park a quarter-mile away and walk the rest of the way along a faint trail. The cabin was old log-built, darkened from decades of weather, with a sagging roof and windows covered in dust. It looked like it hadn't seen much use in years, and that immediately set my nerves on edge. But I told myself it was part of the experience. Remote, quiet, away from everything. Sam, however, wasn't convinced. He stayed close to my legs, growling lowly whenever I looked back at him. Inside, the cabin was bare but functional. A small wood stove in the corner, a few worn chairs, and a bed that looked more like a pallet than anything else. I unpacked quickly, stacked some firewood near the stove, and made sure the doors and windows were locked. I had brought a hunting knife and a small flashlight in case of emergencies, but I didn't think I'd need them. The first night passed uneventfully. I stayed up reading by the fire while Sam lay near my feet. The wind outside howled through the cracks in the logs, but it was the sound of distant, rhythmic scratching that made me uneasy. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just the wind against the trees, maybe some small animal. But the sound was deliberate, moving closer and further in a way that no wind could manage. By the second night, something had changed. Around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of branches snapping outside, like something heavy moving through the trees. Sam was at the door, growling fiercely. I grabbed the flashlight and peered through the small window, trying to see anything in the pitch-black night. That's when I noticed it. A figure crouched in the shadows, unnaturally thin, with long limbs that bent wrong. Its eyes caught the beam of my flashlight, reflecting a strange, yellowish glow. It froze when I shone the light directly on it, then slowly ducked behind a tree. I couldn't move. My heart pounded in my chest, and Sam was trembling but alert, his hackles raised. I wanted to call the police, but cell service was non-existent. I had to wait it out. Hours passed, the wind carrying faint noises, breathing, snapping twigs, low guttural growls. I kept my knife within reach, flashlight in hand, eyes glued to the windows. By morning, the figure was gone, but the area around the cabin was disturbed. Footprints, too large and too elongated to be human, pressed into the dirt and mud. The ground seemed churned, as if something had crouched and moved on all fours. I didn't sleep that day. I tried to keep Sam calm, but he refused to leave the cabin, his gaze constantly scanning the treeline. That night, I decided to stay fully awake, sitting on the edge of the bed with the knife across my lap. Around midnight, I heard it again, the crunching of leaves and twigs. This time, it wasn't just outside. It was coming from behind the cabin, circling, moving faster, quieter. I could hear it breathing now, heavy, ragged, but almost inhuman. Sam barked and growled, darting to the window, then back to me. I caught glimpses of it in the flashlight beam. Tall, hunched, impossibly fast, moving with a grace that no human could manage. Then it stopped. Silence. Too complete. My mind raced. Every story I'd ever read about wilderness predators ran through my head. Coyotes? Bears? But none of them moved like this. None of them seemed to study me, to toy with the idea of my fear. Sam whined softly, and I knew instinctively that we were being hunted, though the predator hadn't attacked. Not yet. I spent the next day trying to plan an escape. The dirt road wasn't far, maybe a half-mile hike if I could make it to the car without being seen. I packed what I could carry, and by sundown I was ready. I waited for darkness, knowing that whatever had been circling the cabin had to rest at some point. 10 p.m., I made my move. Sam and I slipped quietly from the cabin, hugging the tree line to avoid open areas. The night was unnervingly still, the usual sounds of wildlife gone, replaced by the distant sound of something moving parallel to our path. I could hear it behind us now, breaking branches, heavier and slower than before, keeping pace without drawing too much attention. We reached the car after what felt like hours, but was only 20 minutes. I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking, Sam whining softly beside me. When the engine turned over, the sound seemed deafening in the quiet forest. Then I saw it, at the edge of the clearing, partially illuminated by the headlights. The figure was standing on two legs, impossibly tall, head tilted unnaturally, staring at us. Then it dropped to all fours and vanished into the shadows before I could get a clear look. I drove without stopping, keeping my eyes on the dark tree line, until I hit the main highway. It was daylight before I even realized it, the forest fading behind me. I didn't stop at gas stations, didn't call anyone until I was safely back in Denver. Sam slept the entire way, curled up against my legs. I've never gone back to the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. I've heard stories, old local tales, about skinwalkers or shapeshifters, but I don't indulge in folklore. Whatever I saw, it was real and it was alive. It watched me, studied me, and could move faster and more silently than anything I've ever encountered. I think about that night often, how the forest felt alive in a way that wasn't natural, how every instinct in Sam and me screamed that we weren't safe. Years later, I finally understand the lasting impact. I can't explain it, I can't rationalize it. All I know is that something out there is watching, waiting, and I will never, ever return to that cabin. It was the fall of 1997 when I first got assigned to the trail cabin deep in the Montana wilderness. I was 26 at the time, still green but determined. The Forest Service had a small network of these cabins scattered across the Bitterroot National Forest, mostly for rangers to check in, rest, and monitor wildlife. My cabin was tucked along a narrow creek, surrounded by thick pine and fir trees. From the map, it looked like a dot in the middle of nowhere, but from the ground, it felt like the world ended right at the treeline. I arrived late afternoon, hauling my pack with more gear than I probably needed. A rifle, extra blankets, canned food, water purification tablets, a first aid kit, and an old logbook that previous rangers had left behind. The cabin itself was modest, maybe 20 by 20 feet, with a stone chimney on one side and a single metal stove inside. The wood smelled faintly of mildew and smoke. It had electricity, but only from a small generator outside, which meant I had to plan carefully to save power. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not just the quiet of being away from people, but a deep, heavy silence that pressed against the cabin walls. Birds chirped faintly in the distance, and occasionally, a branch snapped under some unseen animal, but mostly, it was like the forest had swallowed every sound. I spent the first day stocking firewood and organizing my supplies. I checked the creek, clear water, fast-moving, perfect for drinking after filtration. I made a small list of patrols for the next week, noting areas where elk had been sighted and spots prone to wildfires. By evening, the wind had picked up, rattling the cabin's windows. The smell of wet earth and pine resin hung in the air. I lit the stove, filled a kettle, and tried to shake off the unease that had settled in my chest. I told myself it was just the isolation. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind was stronger now, whistling through the gaps in the cabin walls. I kept hearing small noises outside, branches breaking, leaves rustling. But every time I glanced out the window, there was nothing but shadows and the dense tree line. Around 3 a.m., I woke to a sound that froze me in place. A low, dragging noise coming from the back of the cabin. Not like an animal, I told myself. It was deliberate, heavy, like someone or something was pulling a large object across the ground. I grabbed my flashlight and my rifle, moving quietly to the door. The moon had broken through the clouds, casting a pale light on the frost-covered ground. Nothing. No footprints. No broken branches. Nothing disturbed beyond the normal chaos of the forest. My heart was pounding so hard I thought the forest itself could hear it. I checked the locks on the door and windows again, triple-checked, then went back to the stove to try to calm down. The dragging sound didn't come back that night, but I didn't sleep more than an hour at a time. Over the next few days, I started noticing more odd things. My supplies were slightly shifted when I hadn't touched them. The firewood stacked neatly outside the cabin looked like it had been disturbed. Logs moved in ways I couldn't have missed. Once, I found a set of footprints near the creek. Not animal, human. Too large for me, and the tread was strange, like worn work boots from decades ago. But when I traced them, they disappeared into thick underbrush and didn't come back out. I told myself it could be a hunter, someone wandering through illegally. But the thought didn't sit well. Montana's backcountry is vast, but the nearest road was over 15 miles away. No one would come this far without leaving some real trace, and even then, why not knock or leave a note? By the fifth night, the unease had turned into a gnawing fear. The wind was worse now, tearing through the trees like it was alive. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of heavy breathing outside, low and measured, coming from the tree line. I froze, the rifle in my hands trembling slightly. I could see nothing in the darkness except moving shadows. I whispered to myself that it was probably an elk or a bear, but the rhythm of the breaths matched nothing I'd heard from wildlife before. Too steady, too intentional. I stayed in the cabin for the next 2 days, patrolling only in daylight. I checked my maps, double-checked supplies, and tried to rationalize everything. Still, every night the noises would start again. Dragging, crunching, slow, steady steps circling the cabin. Once, I thought I saw a shadow move across the roof, but by the time I grabbed the flashlight, it was gone. On the 7th night, the storm came. Heavy rain, wind gusts strong enough to shake the cabin, lightning that lit up the forest in stark, white flashes. I huddled near the stove, watching the shadows dance on the walls. Then I heard it. A knock, soft at first, then louder, coming from the back door. My heart leapt into my throat. I waited, holding my breath, listening. There was nothing for a long moment, then a low growl from outside, followed by the sound of something running off into the trees. I stayed awake the rest of the night, fire blazing, rifle close. At dawn, I walked outside carefully. The storm had washed the ground clean, but I found the back door had been scratched deep, as if someone had tried to get in. I checked the perimeter, no footprints, nothing. It was like the forest had swallowed the intruder whole. By mid-morning, I realized I had to leave. I called into the Forest Service on the radio, explaining the situation. The dispatcher sounded concerned but calm. The team would come in 4 hours. I used that time to pack essentials, leaving the cabin mostly untouched but taking all food and supplies. When the team arrived, they were thorough. Rangers with tracking dogs searched the surrounding area. Nothing. No tracks beyond what I had seen, no signs of anyone hiding. The cabin itself was intact aside from the scratched door. One of the senior rangers told me it wasn't unusual to feel paranoia in these isolated posts, but he admitted he'd never seen anything quite like the marks on my door. We left the forest together, the trees thinning as we approached the road. As we drove out, I kept glancing at the dense timber behind us. I knew that whatever or whoever had been watching me was still out there. The unease never fully left, not even years later, when I returned to other cabins. The isolation, the dark forest, the sense that someone or something could be just beyond the tree line watching quietly is something that sticks with you. Even now, I can't explain it. The forest swallowed every trace, every clue, But I know what I felt in that cabin. The weight of being truly alone, yet not alone. It was real, physical, something alive and deliberate. And that's the part that lingers the most. The knowledge that out there, in the shadows, there are things you can't see, can't track, and maybe will never understand. But they are real and they are patient. I never imagined a weekend getaway could turn into something I'd never forget. It was the spring of 2016, and I had just turned 30. My dog, Max, a golden retriever with a coat that shone like sunlight, had been bouncing around the apartment for weeks because I kept promising him more time outside. I finally decided to rent a small cabin tucked deep in the Allegheny Mountains of Pennsylvania. The kind of place you find by accident if you're driving slowly on the winding roads and happen to notice a hand-painted sign that says, Cabin Rental. The owner, a middle-aged man with sun-beaten skin named Earl, gave me the keys with a nod and a warning that the area could get rough at night. I smiled, thinking he was just joking. The drive to the cabin was longer than I expected, twisting along narrow roads lined with thick trees. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was low, spreading golden streaks across the forest. The cabin sat on the edge of a small, murky pond, the surface perfectly still. It was older than I expected, made of dark, weathered wood with a crooked chimney and moss creeping along the roof. The air smelled damp and earthy, heavy with the scent of pine and wet soil. Max barked excitedly, running in circles, his leash bouncing against my wrist. I felt an immediate sense of relief, like we'd finally escaped the noise and smog of the city. Inside, the cabin was rustic but functional. A small kitchen with a wood-burning stove, a few cracked plates, and an old refrigerator. The living area had a sagging couch, a battered coffee table, and a fireplace that had clearly seen better days. There were 2 bedrooms, each with thin mattresses and threadbare blankets. I set my backpack down and Max immediately jumped onto one of the beds, circling a few times before flopping down. I opened the windows to let in the smell of the forest and the distant hum of birds. Everything felt calm. Too calm, maybe. I spent the evening unpacking, taking Max for a short walk around the pond, throwing sticks, and watching him splash around. The water was cold, and his paws left muddy prints on the grass. When night fell, it came fast, darker than I expected. The forest swallowed the fading light, and the shadows of the trees reached across the cabin like fingers. I built a fire in the stove, letting the warmth fill the small space while Max curled up at my feet. I had packed a few books, and I tried to read, but the quiet was unsettling. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle outside, seemed louder than it should have been. Max's ears perked up at every small noise, and I tried to reassure myself that it was just the wind. Around 11 p.m., I noticed something strange. From my window, I could see faint movements near the tree line by the pond. First, I thought it was deer, but the shapes were too irregular, shifting in ways that didn't match normal animal behavior. I leaned closer to the window, and Max suddenly stood, hackles raised, growling low in his throat. That's when I realized there were footprints along the muddy edge of the pond. Big, heavy prints dragging slightly as though whoever or whatever made them wasn't careful. My stomach tightened. I checked the locks on the doors and windows, convincing myself I was imagining things. Maybe it was just hunters passing through, though it felt too deliberate, too close. I tried to sleep, but Max wouldn't lie down. He stayed by the door, ears twitching, growling at shadows. Around 2 a.m., I heard it. The faint crunch of boots on gravel, coming closer and then stopping. I froze. The cabin's thin walls offered no protection. I could hear a soft, methodical tapping on the porch railing, like someone testing the wood. My heart pounded so hard I thought Max could hear it from the other side of the cabin. I grabbed a flashlight and quietly moved to the front door. Max growled louder, his body rigid. I shined the light outside, but the beam only caught the mist hanging over the pond. Nothing, just mist, but the feeling didn't leave me. I stayed by the door, flashlight ready, until dawn. Every sound, from a snapping branch to the flapping of a bird's wings, set me on edge. By morning, I was exhausted, but the prints were still there, glistening with dew. Whoever or whatever had been outside had left no other evidence, but the memory of that night stayed with me like a shadow. I spent the next day on edge, sticking close to Max, barely venturing beyond the clearing. I kept the fire going inside the cabin, burning wood constantly, and refused to leave doors or windows open. Max's behavior had shifted. He stayed alert, occasionally barking at the woods, but not aggressively. It was as though he knew something was watching, and I could feel his tension feeding into mine. The second night, things escalated. Around 1 a.m., the tapping returned, but louder this time, like someone circling the cabin. Max barked and growled, shaking. I grabbed my baseball bat, standing near the door, trying to convince myself I wasn't overreacting. Then came the sound of scraping on the wooden walls, like nails being dragged slowly across the siding. My blood ran cold. I thought about calling the police, but the cell signal was weak, and it might take hours for anyone to reach me. I realized then that I had only one real option: survive until morning. I stayed awake, Max at my side, clutching the bat, every nerve on edge. The noises continued, erratic now, stopping and starting, almost as if the person, or people, outside were testing my patience, watching me. I tried to keep calm, counting each minute, focusing on Max's steady breathing as a reminder that at least one thing was safe and alive in this place. Dawn broke slowly, a pale light spilling through the trees. Exhausted, I stepped outside with Max on leash. The footprints were gone. Not a trace, not even the mud disturbed by the night before. It was as though no one had been there at all. Relief washed over me, but I stayed cautious. I packed up my things immediately, loaded Max into the car, and drove away, keeping my eyes on the trees, scanning for movement. I didn't look back until I reached the main road. It wasn't until weeks later that I pieced together what might have happened. Local authorities confirmed that a group of poachers had been caught in that area around the same time I was there. They'd been targeting deer illegally and hiding their presence from any hikers or residents. I never saw them, and they never approached the cabin directly, but I knew in my gut that the sounds, the tapping, the scraping, they'd been watching, testing if anyone was inside. Max, as always, had sensed it before I did. Since that trip, I've never stayed in a remote cabin alone, and I always check the surroundings for signs of human activity. The memory of that night, the feeling of being watched, the way the forest seemed alive with silent observers, never left me. Max still looks uneasy in the woods sometimes, ears twitching at sounds I can't hear. But at least now I understand why. That weekend in Pennsylvania taught me that the quietest places can be the most dangerous, and that instincts, both mine and Max's, are worth trusting above everything else. It was the fall of 2012 when I decided to take a week off from work and retreat to the old cabin my uncle had left to me after he passed. I was 34 at the time, and life in the city had been wearing me down. Endless emails, late nights at the office, and the constant hum of traffic had made me feel like a shadow of myself. I needed silence. I needed isolation. The cabin, tucked deep in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, was perfect. The GPS didn't reach the last few miles, and the road narrowed into a rough dirt track that twisted through the dense forest. I remember gripping the steering wheel tightly, feeling the uneven ruts jostle the car as I inched forward, the smell of wet leaves thick in the air, and the early October dusk pressing against the windshield. The cabin itself was small, nothing more than a wooden rectangle with a pitched roof and a stone chimney. It had stood there for decades, its walls darkened by years of rain and wind, but it was solid. I parked the car on the uneven ground beside it, boots crunching on fallen pine needles, and stepped inside. The air smelled musty, the faint scent of cedar lingering from my uncle's old furniture. Dust motes floated in the slanting light coming through the windows. I left the keys on the counter, set down my bag, and took a long look around. The cabin had no electricity, only a few oil lamps, a wood stove, and an old cast iron sink. I liked it. It felt untouched. I spent the first evening chopping wood for the stove and making a simple meal of canned beans and bread. Outside, the forest was quiet, almost too quiet, with only the occasional rustle of squirrels or the distant call of a crow. I didn't notice at first, but by late evening, the quiet had a weight to it, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. My dog, a German shepherd named Max, was curled by the stove, ears twitching at every crack of the fire. He had always been sensitive to my moods, and I could tell he sensed the tension I didn't yet understand. That night, I went to bed early. The cabin's single bedroom had a small mattress on a wooden frame, a wool blanket folded at the foot. Max slept at my feet, but sleep was elusive. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to a sound that made my stomach tighten. A low, dragging noise outside, along the side of the cabin. My heart beat fast, and I froze listening. The sound wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an animal. It was deliberate, slow, and heavy. Max growled, low in his throat, ears forward. I stayed still, telling myself it was probably a branch or a raccoon. But then I heard it again, closer now, scraping along the wooden siding near the back door. I wasn't thinking clearly. I grabbed a flashlight from the counter and crept to the window. I swept the beam over the ground, the trees, the narrow path that led to the cabin, but there was nothing. Max stiffened beside me, hackles raised, growling low. My pulse was loud in my ears. I tried to convince myself to go back to bed, but the sound kept returning, irregular and heavy. I spent the next day walking the perimeter, inspecting the cabin and the surrounding forest. The ground was disturbed in odd places. Footprints, maybe 2 sets, but they were irregular, like someone had been dragging something heavy through the underbrush. I took photos with my phone, though the signal was weak and the pictures wouldn't upload. There was no sign of anyone else around, no tracks leading far from the cabin, nothing but the occasional broken branch and crushed leaves. Still, the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. I could sense it pressing against my back, especially when I was alone outside, chopping wood or gathering water from the stream half a mile away. On the 3rd night, it got worse. I had stacked the firewood close to the cabin, trying to get the stove going for warmth. Max and I were both tense. His ears flicked at every sound, his body rigid. Around 11 p.m., I heard the scraping again, this time at the front door. Whoever or whatever it was careful but persistent. I stayed in the bedroom with the flashlight, trying to steady my breathing, Max growling, teeth bared. After 10 minutes, the noise stopped, but not before I noticed a faint outline in the dirt near the front steps. Something had been dragging, leaving a trail from the woods to the door. I knew I couldn't stay passive any longer. I grabbed the only tool I had that could serve as a weapon, a heavy iron poker from the stove, and crept to the door. My hands shook. The dragging sound started again, but this time I could hear it coming from inside the cabin. I froze, realizing the unmistakable weight of something large being moved across the floorboards in the main room. Max barked and leapt forward, knocking the door open. The light from my flashlight cut across the cabin, and for a moment, I froze in disbelief. There, in the corner of the room, partially hidden behind a stack of firewood, was a man. He was thin, pale, with dark circles under his eyes, looking like he hadn't eaten properly in days. His clothes were torn, and his hands were scraped and dirty. He froze as Max barked, staring at the dog and me with wide eyes. I realized he was hiding, waiting. I could see now that the dragging sound was him moving around the cabin quietly, trying to find a place to sleep or rummage for food. I didn't panic. I had been terrified for hours, but the situation suddenly made sense. I kept the poker raised, and Max stayed close, growling low. I spoke calmly, even though I knew he couldn't hear me well. After a few tense seconds, he slumped against the wall, exhausted, and didn't move. I slowly stepped forward, keeping my distance. He was weak, hungry, and shivering. I could see he was dangerous only in his desperation, not by choice. I gave him some water from the jug on the counter and a small portion of my canned beans. He ate silently, and though I didn't trust him, I understood. The forest was harsh. I left him in the corner with a blanket, keeping Max between us. I stayed awake all night, keeping watch, listening to every sound, ensuring he didn't make another move. By dawn, he had fallen into a deep sleep. The next morning, I drove the 20 miles to the nearest town and called the police. I explained the situation. They returned with a team, took the man away, and handled the situation professionally. He had been living in the forest for weeks, maybe longer, and was suffering from severe malnutrition and exhaustion. The dragging sounds, the footprints, the way he moved carefully around the cabin. It was survival, nothing more. I returned to the cabin later that week. It felt quieter now, almost peaceful. Max and I walked the perimeter and I inspected the damage. There were scratches on the floorboards, marks on the walls, and the firewood pile was knocked over. But the cabin had survived, as had I. I stacked fresh wood, cleaned the place, and started the fire. I sat by the stove, Max curled at my feet, and I realized that fear doesn't always come from the supernatural. Sometimes it comes from people desperate and unpredictable, and the forest doesn't care who survives. That trip changed the way I thought about isolation, about trust, and about survival. I didn't just escape the fear, I understood it. The forest had tested me, and I had faced it without illusions. The cabin, scarred but standing, became a symbol for me of resilience, caution, and respect for both nature and the people who wander through it, intentionally or otherwise. And though I never saw that man again, I remembered the weight of that night, the sound of dragging across the floor, and the primal sense of vulnerability that comes with being truly alone. It was the summer of 2016 when I decided to take a break from everything and head up to northern Wisconsin, far away from the city and the constant noise of Chicago. I was 26, working a job that drained me more every day, and I had this idea that maybe a week alone in the woods would help me reset. I rented a small cabin about a mile off the nearest dirt road, surrounded by thick pine and birch forest, with a small lake reflecting the sky a little ways off. The cabin was old, built in the 70s, and smelled faintly of mildew and old wood, but it had a solid roof, running water, and a wood stove that would heat the whole place. Perfect, I thought, perfect for solitude. The drive up was long and quiet. The further north I went, the less traffic there was, and by the time I turned onto the dirt road that would take me to the cabin, there was only the occasional sound of birds or the rustling of leaves in the wind. I parked my old Subaru in the small clearing in front of the cabin, unpacked my bags, and took a long look at the place. The porch sagged a little on the left side. The paint had peeled almost completely from the walls, and the windows were dusty. Inside, it smelled of pine and damp, the kind of smell that sticks in your nose after a storm. I set down my bag, pulled off my boots, and sat at the edge of the wooden chair by the stove. It felt good to just sit, listen, and breathe. That first day, I explored the small area around the cabin. The lake wasn't more than a 5-minute walk, and the water was clear but cold. I noticed tracks along the mud near the edge, deer tracks, maybe a raccoon, and a few prints I couldn't immediately identify. I didn't think much of it at the time. The forest seemed quiet but alive, and I liked it. I went back to the cabin before sunset, started a fire in the stove, and cooked some beans and sausage on the little stovetop. I felt relaxed, in a way I hadn't felt in years. The first night, though, was strange. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up to a sound outside. At first, I thought it was an animal, a raccoon, maybe, or a fox, but the noise didn't quite fit. It was a dragging sound, slow and deliberate, moving along the side of the cabin. My heart started racing. I lay there for what felt like hours listening, but it stopped after maybe 10 minutes. I told myself it was just a branch scraping against the wall in the wind, but I didn't sleep well after that. The next day, I tried to shake it off. I spent the morning fishing at the lake, and by afternoon, I was chopping wood for the stove. That's when I noticed something odd. A piece of my firewood was moved. I had stacked the pile neatly against the side of the cabin, and one of the logs had been rolled a few feet away. I stared at it for a long time, trying to convince myself it was the wind, but it didn't make sense. The logs were heavy, and the wind didn't blow them that far. By the third day, things escalated. I was sitting outside on the porch, notebook in hand, just sketching the trees and the lake, when I noticed footprints leading from the tree line to the cabin. They weren't mine, and they weren't animal prints. They were human. I froze. They ended at the edge of the porch, then disappeared. No prints leading back. My stomach turned over. I went inside and locked the door, double-checked the windows, and spent the evening sitting by the fire with a baseball bat I found in the corner. I felt foolish, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me. That night, the dragging sound returned, louder and closer. It moved around the cabin, circling, then stopping at the back. I could hear something scraping against the wall, slow and heavy. I stayed awake all night, bat in hand, listening to it move. When the sun finally came up, I cautiously went outside. The back of the cabin had scratches, deep enough to leave marks on the wood, and there were small piles of dirt scattered around, like someone had been digging briefly and left. I spent that day on edge, checking every corner of the cabin, inspecting the perimeter. I even made a plan. If anyone showed up, I would retreat to the small attic in the cabin, which had a trapdoor in the corner of the room, and call 911 from my cell. The problem was that service was patchy at best, and I couldn't be sure I'd get a signal if it came to that. The night after that, I didn't sleep at all. The dragging and scratching came back, and I could hear heavy breathing outside the door, just beyond the walls. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it had to be some local kids messing around, but the weight of it pressed on me like a physical thing. My nerves were shredded. I kept thinking about the stories you hear of people living in cabins getting robbed, or worse. On the 5th day, I decided I couldn't wait anymore. I packed my things quietly, loaded them into the car, and started my engine before sunrise. As I drove down the dirt road, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror. Shadows seemed to move among the trees, though I tried to tell myself it was just the early morning light. My chest ached with tension, and I didn't stop driving until I reached a small gas station in a town about 30 miles away. I called the sheriff from there and explained what had happened. They were skeptical at first, asking me for details about the cabin and the area. I told them about the footprints, the scratches, the dragging noises, everything. They sent a deputy to check it out, and when I returned with them 2 days later, the scene was unsettling. The cabin had been approached recently, footprints everywhere, and it looked like someone had tried to break in through the back window. They hadn't gotten far, though. Nothing was stolen, and no one was inside. It was clear someone had been watching the cabin for days, and I had been right to leave. The sheriff told me it was likely some transient or local troublemaker, someone who targeted isolated cabins for fun or mischief. Nothing supernatural, nothing unexplainable, just a person. They reminded me how dangerous it could have been if I had stayed. The relief I felt was immense, but it came with a lingering tension. I realized how quickly a sense of security could vanish in a place that seemed so peaceful. I never returned to that cabin. I eventually sold the idea to a friend who wanted a summer getaway, warning them about the location and the fact that someone had been lurking around. The experience stayed with me for years, shaping how I looked at solitude and wilderness. Peaceful as nature seemed, I learned that danger could appear quietly, without warning, and that the real terror often comes from other humans, not the trees or the wind. Even now, when I drive past rural areas or think about remote cabins, I feel that twinge of caution. It's not fear of the wild itself, but of the unpredictability of people, and the reminder that sometimes being alone is never truly being alone. It was the spring of 2012, a time when I had just turned 29, and I needed a break from the constant hum of city life. I had been working as a junior civil engineer in Denver for several years, and the weight of deadlines, office politics, and the endless roar of traffic had finally pushed me to book a small, remote cabin in northern Idaho. The cabin, tucked deep in the Selkirk Mountains, promised isolation, fresh air, and a chance to reset. What I didn't know was that it would become the most frightening experience of my life. I arrived in the late afternoon, the sky a muted gray as clouds stretched over the mountain peaks. The drive from the nearest town, Sandpoint, had been long and winding, and every mile took me further into dense forests of fir and cedar. I remember the way the trees pressed against the narrow road, their branches swaying in the wind, casting long shadows even though the sun was still high. The air smelled sharp and clean, tinged with pine and damp earth. The cabin itself was small, made of rough-hewn logs with a single stone chimney. It looked like something out of an old postcard. Charming in pictures, but in real life, it felt oddly imposing, almost as if it had been waiting there for years, untouched by time. There was a porch with a wooden railing, worn smooth by weather and footsteps, and the front door creaked on its hinges when I pushed it open. Inside, the air smelled faintly of mildew and wood smoke. The furniture was sparse. A table, a couple of chairs, a small stove in the corner, and a bed covered with a heavy quilt. There were no modern appliances besides a small fridge and a propane lamp. The first night was quiet in a way that city people don't usually experience. I was used to a dull, constant hum of life, the faraway sirens, car horns, neighbors talking, but here there was nothing. Only the wind in the trees and the occasional snap of a branch somewhere outside. I ate a simple dinner of canned soup, trying not to think too much about the stillness around me. I kept the lamp lit in the corner of the room, not because I was afraid, but because the shadows seemed to move on their own when the light was low. By the second day, I had settled into a routine. I hiked the trails nearby, taking photographs of the rugged landscape, and tried to enjoy the solitude. My dog, a golden retriever named Max, was my constant companion. He was usually calm, but even he seemed unusually alert, ears twitching at sounds I couldn't hear. That afternoon, while I was gathering firewood near the edge of a small clearing, Max froze suddenly, his hackles raised, staring toward the thick woods beyond the trees. I followed his gaze but saw nothing. The feeling of being watched started as a tickling unease, a slight tension in my stomach, but I shrugged it off. The woods were dense and wild. Animals made noises. That was all. Nightfall came quickly. The mountains had a way of swallowing light, and soon, shadows pooled around the cabin. I lit the stove and poured myself a cup of instant coffee, trying to calm the creeping anxiety that seemed to hang in the air. Max stayed close, lying near the bed, eyes occasionally flicking toward the window. Then I heard it. It was faint at first, a soft, almost rhythmic thumping. My heart skipped. I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer hitting a fallen branch, but the sound repeated, steady and deliberate, coming from the edge of the clearing behind the cabin. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly walked outside, Max close at my heels. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees and brush. There was nothing there, nothing moving, no footprints, no shadows, just the sound of the wind through the pines. And then it stopped. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. The isolation was playing tricks on me. I returned to the cabin, double-checked the locks on the doors, and sat down with a notebook, writing down everything I felt. Writing helped calm me, made the cabin feel more like a temporary shelter than a trap. Max finally settled down, though he kept glancing toward the dark window panes, low growl rumbling in his chest every so often. The following day, the wind picked up, and a light rain began to fall, soaking the forest in a gray mist. I decided to stay inside and sort through some old maps I had found in the cabin's drawer. They were hand-drawn, showing the property lines of surrounding land, old trails, and streams that no longer existed on modern maps. I traced the lines with my finger, fascinated, when I noticed something odd. A small path led from the edge of the clearing directly to the cabin, one that didn't appear on any modern map. Curiosity turned to unease. That path looked fresh, like it had been used recently. I went outside to inspect it, Max walking beside me cautiously. There were faint footprints pressed into the damp earth, boots, not shoes. They led up to the porch, circled once, and then disappeared back into the forest. My stomach turned. I hadn't seen anyone else since I arrived. The nearest neighbor was miles away. Whoever had walked here had either come very quietly or had been watching for a long time. That night, I barely slept. Every small noise, the drip of rain, the creak of the cabin, Max scratching at the floor, made me jump. Around midnight, I woke to a scraping sound at the back door. It was slow and deliberate, like someone dragging a heavy object. I froze, holding my breath, and listened. The sound stopped after a few seconds. I didn't move. I didn't dare look outside. I sat up with Max by my side, heart hammering, and waited for hours until the first light of dawn. When the sun finally rose, I ventured outside. The rain had washed away the footprints, but the back door had small scratches along the bottom. Whoever or whatever had been here had left a sign. I decided not to panic, but I knew I couldn't stay another night. I packed my things quickly, loading them into the car. Max was restless, whining, as if he knew too. I locked the cabin and started down the winding mountain road, keeping my eyes on the thick trees that loomed on either side. As I drove, the unease didn't leave me. The isolation that had once felt like freedom now felt like a trap. By the time I reached the main highway and the familiar hum of traffic, I felt almost absurdly relieved. The cabin was behind me, small and silent among the trees, but I could still feel it pressing against my memory. I never returned to that cabin. Years later, I learned that a man had been living illegally in the forest nearby, moving between abandoned cabins and watching the trails. He was arrested after a ranger found evidence of break-ins. It made sense, the footprints, the scratches, the sense of being watched. Knowing it wasn't random or supernatural didn't erase the fear, but it did make the memory clear, real, and tangible. I had been lucky. Max had sensed danger when I had not, and we had both escaped without harm. The experience left me with a lasting respect for isolation and the wilderness. The mountains are beautiful, yes, but they also have a quiet that can hide very real threats. I still hike, still explore, but I never take solitude for granted. And every time I drive past a forest or see a cabin tucked into the trees, I remember that spring of 2012, the thumping at the edge of the clearing, the path that wasn't on any map, and the night that tested every instinct I had. I hadn't been back to my grandmother's cabin in nearly 15 years. It was tucked deep in the woods of northern Maine, far enough from the nearest town that cell service was unreliable, and the road leading up to it had long since been swallowed by weeds and fallen branches. The last time I'd been there, I was 16, and my grandmother was still alive, insisting I take a walk through the dense pines with her. She died the following winter, and after her funeral, the cabin had been left untouched, locked and quiet, the keys buried in a shoebox in my father's attic. I decided to visit on a late August afternoon in 2023, drawn by a need to face the memories and perhaps clear out some of the old things. The drive alone was enough to unsettle me. The narrow road turned from gravel to dirt and then, eventually, to nothing but a barely there trail through towering pines. My old Jeep rattled and groaned under the weight of overgrown branches scraping against the roof, the smell of wet earth thick in the humid air. When I finally reached the cabin, it was worse than I remembered. Moss clung to the roof, the windows were streaked with grime, and the porch sagged under the weight of years of neglect. The door resisted when I tried the key, creaking loudly, and I had to give it a hard shove to get it open. The air inside was stale, thick with the smell of mildew and old wood. Sunlight filtered through the grimy windows, casting pale streaks across the floorboards. I could see where my grandmother had left her rocking chair near the fireplace, dust-coated and unmoved for years, and the faded floral curtains hung limply in the windows. The kitchen was still, the sink filled with cracked dishes that had long ago collected layers of dust and dirt. Everything smelled of decay, not in the sense of rot, but the slow, lingering smell of a house left to itself for too long. I set my bag down and decided to check the bedrooms first. The main bedroom, my grandmother's, was almost exactly as I remembered it. The bedspread was a faded quilt, the pillow flattened with age. But it wasn't until I opened the door to the small guest room that I noticed something strange. The floor was scratched, the wooden boards warped as if something heavy had been dragged across them recently. I froze, listening. The cabin was silent except for the faint whistle of wind through the broken panes. I told myself it was just animals or my imagination. That's when I noticed it. The smell hit me first, sickly sweet, almost metallic. My stomach dropped. I followed the scent, hesitant, down to the far corner of the guest room. At first, I thought it was some animal that had died, a raccoon or something, but the shape made me stop cold. It was a body. Couldn't believe my eyes. The man, or maybe a woman, it was hard to tell at first, was slumped against the wall, knees bent, arms at the sides. The skin was gray and mottled, the eyes half open, staring at nothing. There was a gash across the forehead, dark and crusted, and the smell of blood was pungent in the still air. My hands shook, and I took a step back, almost tripping over a broken chair. The body had clearly been there for days, maybe weeks, given the stiffness and the way the clothing stuck to the skin. Panic began to set in, but I knew I had to think clearly. I grabbed my phone, hoping for some signal, but there was none. Not a bar. I cursed under my breath and realized I would have to leave the cabin and find help on foot. But before I could move, I noticed the details around the body. The scattered papers on the floor, a tipped-over chair, a set of muddy footprints leading to the back door. Someone had been here. Someone had brought this person into my grandmother's cabin. I couldn't stay. I ran back to the Jeep, the wind pressing against my face, the sound of my heart pounding loud in my ears. I shoved the key in, started the engine, and drove down the narrow trail as fast as I could without flipping the Jeep into a ditch. My mind raced. Who could have done this? Why here in a cabin no one visited for years? I found help eventually, flagging down a state trooper about 15 minutes down the road. They followed me back, and the scene confirmed everything I'd feared. The body had been there for at least a week. There were no signs of forced entry at the front, but the back door had been left unlocked. Muddy footprints tracked across the cabin floor, and several personal items had been taken. The investigators said it was likely a transient who had been hiding out, maybe trying to steal, and things had gone wrong. No ghosts, no fairy tales, just human cruelty and misfortune. The aftermath was strange. The cabin was cleaned, the body removed, and eventually, the authorities set up a temporary investigation post to monitor the area. I stayed away for months, visiting only once or twice to check the property from a distance. Each time, the smell of the woods and the memory of that day pressed against me like a weight. My grandmother's cabin, once a place of comfort, had become a chilling reminder of the unexpected darkness that could intrude even in the most familiar places. Over time, I started slowly restoring the cabin. It took almost a year, but the smell of mildew went away, the windows were scrubbed clean, and the floors were replaced. I planted flowers along the porch and repainted the siding. Every detail mattered. I wanted to reclaim the space, to make it feel alive again. It wasn't easy, and sometimes at night, I'd hear the snap of a branch or the rustle of leaves, and my stomach would twist, remembering the body, the gash, the way the eyes seemed to follow me. But eventually, the house felt like mine again. Now, standing on the porch, looking at the trees swaying in the late afternoon sun, I feel a strange kind of peace. I can still remember the terror, the revulsion, the fear, but I also remember the determination it took to come back, to take back this cabin that had meant so much to my grandmother and, eventually, to me. It's not a place of fairy tales or ghosts. It's a place of real, harsh life. The kind of life that reminds you, sometimes painfully, that death and danger are closer than you think. But it's also a place of survival. I learned that the hard way. The cabin isn't just an old building. It's a testament to resilience, to people returning, cleaning up, reclaiming what was theirs. That dead body will always haunt the memory of that first visit, but it doesn't haunt the cabin anymore. It's mine now, a real place in the world, standing strong amid the pines, a reminder that even when something terrifying happens, there is a way to make it right, to move forward, to keep living. I remember that trip like it was yesterday, even though it was the winter of 1997. I was 28, freshly divorced, and I thought a few days in the woods of northern Minnesota would clear my head. I had rented a small, isolated hunting cabin just off the edge of a frozen lake. The place wasn't fancy, just a wooden shack built in the 60s with warped floorboards and a sagging roof. But I liked it that way. It promised solitude, and after months of city noise, I craved silence. I drove in on a Thursday morning, my old Ford pickup crunching through the snow-packed dirt road. The air was bitter, the kind that makes your lungs burn the second you step outside. I pulled up to the cabin and parked, the engine echoing in the empty forest like a faint warning. My dog, Max, a lean border collie with a black and white coat, jumped out, shaking snow from his fur. He always had this instinctive sense when something felt off, and that day he didn't seem happy about the cabin. The cabin was exactly as the listing described. A single room with a small kitchenette, a wood stove, and a lofted sleeping area. Outside, the forest stretched endlessly, trees heavy with snow, their branches bending under the weight. I unpacked my hunting gear, stacked firewood, and built a small fire in the stove. The smell of burning pine filled the room, and I let out a long breath, letting myself feel a little lighter. That evening, I went out for a short walk along the lake, Max trotting close. The ice on the lake groaned under the shifting cold, and every crack made me jump. I wasn't afraid of the wildlife. I had spent summers hunting with my father, but there was something in the air that felt tense. I shrugged it off as being alone. By the time I returned, the sun had disappeared, leaving the forest dark and shadowed. I settled in for the night, the cabin quiet except for the soft creaks of the old structure and the occasional howl of a distant wolf. Max slept at my feet, ears twitching. Around midnight, I woke to a scraping sound at the back of the cabin. My heart jumped. I froze, listening. The sound stopped, then started again, slower, deliberate. It wasn't like the wind or snow. It was the sound of something or someone moving outside. I grabbed my rifle and crept to the window, careful not to make a sound. The forest was pitch black, but there, in the dim light of the moon reflecting off the snow, I saw tracks leading up to the cabin. Fresh tracks, human tracks. I could feel my pulse in my throat. The cabin was supposed to be empty for miles. I thought about calling for help, but my cell phone had no service. I retreated to the center of the cabin, rifle ready, and waited. The scratching sound returned, this time from the side door. Max growled low in his throat, and I shushed him, telling myself to stay calm. The door handle rattled. Someone was trying the door. I realized then how truly isolated I was. I was completely cut off. No neighbors, no phone, no one who would even notice if something went wrong until days later. I checked the windows, the old locks barely holding. I couldn't open a window quietly if I needed to escape. My mind raced through every possible scenario, and each one made me feel smaller and more exposed. The scratching stopped, replaced by a slow, deliberate thump, like someone testing the floorboards outside. I could see Max's hackles rise. Then I remembered the small loft where I slept. If I could make it there quickly, I'd have a vantage point, at least. I moved as silently as I could, climbing the ladder, and crouched above the main room. From there, I could see the shadows shift across the snow outside the window. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. I had no sense of time. Eventually, the noises outside faded. I waited until the first hint of dawn, listening to every creak and groan of the cabin. When light finally came, I peered out. The tracks I had seen the night before were gone. Snow had covered them in a light dusting, as if whatever had been there had vanished into thin air. I didn't relax, but I convinced myself that maybe it had been some other traveler or a hunter like me. I tried to enjoy the day. I went for a long walk in the woods with Max, keeping the cabin in sight. I noticed small details I hadn't the day before. The tracks of deer, the marks of a snowshoe hare, the way the wind made the trees moan like a distant train. But something felt off. The silence was too heavy, almost purposeful. The further I walked, the more I felt like I was being watched. When I returned, I found the back door slightly ajar. I was careful, checking the locks, my hands trembling. Nothing inside seemed touched, but the thought that someone had been in my cabin while I was away made my stomach churn. I spent the evening reinforcing the door, nailing boards across it where I could, and tying Max's leash to the stove so he couldn't wander. That night, I slept fitfully, the fire dying down to embers, and I kept the rifle within reach. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay. Something about the cabin, the tracks, the sounds, everything combined into a fear I couldn't shake. I packed quickly, tossing gear into my truck, trying not to look at the forest surrounding me. As I started the engine, I noticed something on the snow by the road. A small pile of sticks arranged in a triangle. It seemed innocent enough, almost like someone had left it by accident. But in the context of the previous 2 nights, it made my blood run cold. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town, a small cluster of buildings and a gas station about 15 miles away. I reported the cabin to the rental agency and the local sheriff, describing the tracks, the noises, and the sticks. They promised to check it out. Later, I heard from the agency that the cabin had been broken into, Someone had been living there in secret, hiding from authorities. They had moved on just days before my arrival. Even years later, I think about those nights, about the cold, the silence, and the feeling that something was right outside the door. Max still reacts when we drive past empty cabins or snow-covered woods. And I never stayed in a remote cabin alone again. The fear I felt was not some storybook terror. It was real, human, and close. It was the kind of fear that makes you appreciate every warm light, every locked door, every familiar face. That trip changed the way I see isolation, and I carry the memory of that cabin like a warning. Some places aren't scary because of ghosts. They're scary because humans can be dangerous, quiet, and patient in ways you don't expect.